Now to France, where more than 200 centrists and left-wing candidates have pulled out of the country's parliamentary runoff election ahead of today's deadline. The aim is to avoid splitting the vote amongst centrist and left-wing parties in Sunday's runoff. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron hopes the pullout will block the far-right from winning power after his centrists came third in the first round behind a coalition of left-wing parties and behind the far-right National Rally. And the National Rally's leader, Marine Le Pen, has celebrated its strong showing, but says her party won't govern unless it has an absolute majority.
Of course, we cannot accept going into the government if we cannot act. What our voters ask is to change the policies that were put in place. If we cannot change them, and if we accept going into the government just to sit down in a minister's chair, if we cannot act, that would be, for me, the worst betrayal we can do towards our voters.
Let's get more from Cole Stangler. He's a freelance journalist based in Marseille in the south of France. Welcome back to DW. Let's start with what we just heard from Marine Le Pen. Do you think she really will allow some other party to become Prime Minister if her National Rally doesn't get the majority she wants? Or is this just rhetoric to get the vote out?
No, I mean, I think she certainly wants to mobilize her base, as we're getting close to that second round. So that's part of it, But another interesting thing that Marine Le Pen said today is that there could potentially look to other partners to be part of a governing coalition. That is very much a kind of gesture that's being made towards almost certainly the historically mainstream right-wing party to see if they don't get an absolute majority, which is looking less and less likely given those withdrawals you just mentioned of other candidates, could the RN potentially govern with the support of the mainstream right, the right-wing party, Les Républicains? I think in any case, they would absolutely want to have a far-right prime minister, and it would be Jordan Bardella. There's no doubt about that. That's what they're pushing for.
So how is it looking? Do the centre and left parties have enough support to block the far-right?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable here, just really in the last couple of days, after this very vicious campaign rhetoric that we saw from, in large part, the Macronists in government and also the left criticizing one another. Those figures you cited, it's quite remarkable. We're now in a scenario in which you have fewer chances of the RN actually winning an absolute majority. We're going to have to see some polling given the new realignment. But I think at this point, it's unlikely the RN will get an absolute majority. We could have potentially a relative majority. Could they cobble together something with another party? Or could we potentially have some type of technocratic caretaker government if no majority is formed? Maybe the least likely scenario is the left, the part of the mainstream right, and the Macronists. So still unanswered questions, but I think certainly that scenario of a far-right absolute majority is looking less and less likely after those withdrawals, without a doubt.
And it's interesting what you say about perhaps a coalition on the right. The right-wing party here in Germany is very much seen as a pariah, and other parties have said that they will not work with them. That sounds like that's not the case there in France.
Well, historically, it has been the case, absolutely. We can remember Jacques Chirac in 2002 handily defeating Jean-Marie Le Pen. Historically, this has been the case, but we've entered a new era of French politics where already we've seen the head of Les Républicains, the historic right-wing party, say he wants to do an alliance with the far right. He's been expelled from his party, and he's doing that alliance. But even today, Les Républicains notably did not call for withdrawing candidates against the far right. So in that respect, they had a different line than the Macronists, a different line than the left. And this is consistent with what we've seen. The mainstream right is getting more and more pushed to the far right. And at what point will it cease to exist? A lot of people are asking that question.
OK, thanks for talking us through that. Cole Stangler, freelance journalist and author. Let's get more from our correspondent Rosie Birchard in Brussels. Welcome, Rosie. So talk us through what's happening today. How will withdrawing candidates help to prevent the far right from winning this absolute majority that they seek?
Yeah, all those parties outside the far right are really trying to work out not how to win the second round of these elections, but how to keep the far right out of power. And of course, they are really at the gates of power now, closer than we've ever seen before in French history. Now, this is all essentially a quirk of France's two-round electoral system, because in the first round, it was a sort of open ballot, so many candidates could put themselves forward. And all of those who got 12.5% of the vote could go through, unless there were some cases where there was already an outright majority and a decent turnout. So 577 seats overall, and most of them, around 500 of them, are still up for grabs. So it's all to play for in all those 500 constituencies. Now, what we've seen is parties which are outside the far right, so that's really from the far left to the centre and centre right of the spectrum, deciding to, in some cases, withdraw their candidates back out of three-horse races to avoid splitting the vote. We've seen at least 200 candidates do this so far, but that means that there will still be a few dozen three-horse races come Sunday, and those really may be the ones to watch. And I think it will really be a nail-biting election for French people as they see what could be kind of historic changes in their country afoot.
And do you see any way for President Macron's ensemble party to stay in power?
They will undoubtedly lose influence. There's a couple of different scenarios of how this could play out. We could see the far right winning the absolute majority that they've been trying to get, which would allow them to get into government, essentially, and secure the prime ministership. We could see a hung parliament where we have disparate blocs, nobody having an absolute majority, nobody being able to immediately govern. And that might lead to some attempt to coalition build from the centrist camp of President Macron. And listen, that sounds really normal for a lot of European countries. There are coalitions in Germany, there are coalitions here in Belgium, but it is not in any way in the playbook of French politicians. It's not something they're used to. And the third option could be that we end up with a technocratic government in France, so that the president names bureaucrats, unelected officials, to take over roles and really just pursue minimalist policy. All of those options are uncharted territory and may lead to some sort of political paralysis and certainly uncertainty in Paris.
Zoom out for us and talk to us about the potential effects of Sunday's vote on Europe and perhaps beyond.
Well, briefly, just on France, I mean, that's where the effects might be most profound, because the government and prime minister really have the bigger sway over domestic policy. And let's not forget, this party has long campaigned on a hard anti-immigrant stance. They want to send non-French citizens in France to the back of the queue for things like social housing and welfare. They would like to restrict the rights of dual nationals, keep them from certain key posts in, for example, security. And let's not forget also that the 2022 manifesto of Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Rally, said that she would like to ban women from wearing Islamic head coverings in all public spaces in France. Now, foreign policy, zooming out, that really essentially the power there lies in the hands of the president, and President Emmanuel Macron's term runs on paper until 2027. So the big foreign policy decisions like supporting Ukraine should in theory still lie with him. Still, there is almost no way to see that he doesn't come out of this election politically weakened, if not constitutionally challenged. And I think the question on a lot of people's lips, including I think within his party, is why on earth did he call these elections in the first place? He did not have to. The snap polls were called just early in June after the bad showing of his party in European elections. It was seen as a big political gamble. Come Sunday, we'll see if that can pay off in any way. But right now, it's really looking more like it will backfire quite spectacularly, according to what President Emmanuel Macron was seeking, which was to try and lessen the power of the far right.
Thanks, Rosie. Rosie Birchard in Brussels.
Now, many of France's European partners are watching the election nervously, aware that a far-right win could have huge implications for the European Union.
France's national rally on a roll, from strong showings in European elections and the first round of parliamentary voting in France. Party leaders Jordan Bardella and Marine Le Pen promise a France that is more French, less European. That cuts across multiple areas, from foreign and military policy to welfare spending and cooperation with its neighbors. The National Rally has long been skeptical of Europe and NATO. Until earlier this year, its party program officially called for deepening diplomatic ties with Russia. The party received a major loan from a Russian bank in recent years. It wants to halt military cooperation projects with Germany, including jointly developed next-generation tanks and fighter jets. The party platform also mentioned leaving NATO's command structure. However, the party removed all that language from its website in the run-up to recent elections, and leaders have denounced Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The question is whether moderating its image means that the party has fundamentally changed its stance. The National Rally has promised to stand for French financial and economic interests above those of Europe. It wants to negotiate exceptions to some EU rules and to institute a national preference for French businesses and agriculture against EU's common market rules. A National Rally triumph could kill off EU borrowing to fund defense and transitioning to a green economy. Critics have warned that the party's economic plans, which include cutting taxes and raising wages, will fuel inflation and break EU deficit rules. Clashes with the EU could weaken the euro and destabilize the whole continent's finances. The party also wants to withhold part of France's contribution to the EU budget. The party has long had a strong anti-immigrant stance. It's pledged to prioritize French-born citizens for welfare benefits and housing, which is also against EU rules. Critics say it would formalize discrimination against immigrants at a time when the continent is struggling to come up with a common immigration policy. Whatever happens in the second round of voting, Emmanuel Macron will still be president. He'll likely have to share power, appointing a prime minister from another party. Though the president theoretically directs foreign policy, the cabinet and the National Assembly must sign off and pay the bills, setting the stage for infighting and paralysis in one of the EU's founding countries.